The wind howled through the barren streets of Ashford, a small northern town swallowed by winter's merciless grip. Snowdrifts piled high against the buildings, the icy wind biting through even the thickest layers of clothing. Streetlights flickered, their glow barely cutting through the swirling storm that painted the night in shades of white and gray. Daniel Hayes adjusted the collar of his heavy wool coat as he stepped out of the grocery store, a small brown paper bag clutched in his gloved hand. He exhaled, watching his breath swirl into the freezing air before disappearing into the storm. The cold had settled deep into his bones, a familiar presence that never truly left. At 68, Daniel had long since stopped noticing the passage of seasons. They came and went, blending together in a monotonous cycle of silent mornings and empty evenings. His days were predictable. Wake up, drink coffee, read the newspaper, take a short walk if the weather allowed, then return to his small, weathered cabin on the outskirts of town. He spoke to few, kept to himself, and that was how he preferred it. Or so he told himself. He hadn't always been this way. Once, his life had been full, filled with purpose, companionship, and warmth. His career as a detective had given him structure, and his wife, Evelyn, had given him meaning. She had been the heart of their home, the light in his life. But time had a cruel way of taking what mattered most. 5 years had passed since he had lost her, and in those years he had let himself drift further from the world, closing himself off from the pain of loss by keeping everything else at arm's length. He quickened his pace against the wind, the snow crunching under his boots as he made his way toward his truck. The streets were empty, the town having retreated indoors to the warmth of their homes. He envied them, their laughter muffled by the storm, their lights glowing softly behind frosted windows. Then a sound cut through the wind, faint, almost imperceptible, a whimper. Daniel stopped mid-step, his brow furrowing. The wind howled again, drowning out the noise, making him question if he had imagined it. He turned his head, scanning the desolate street. Nothing. With a sigh, he shook his head and took another step. Then, there it was again, a weak, barely audible sound, lost beneath the storm, but undeniably real. His gaze shifted toward the side of the road, where an old, rusted sedan sat half buried in snow. Something moved. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Beneath the undercarriage, partially hidden by the thick layer of frost and ice, was a small bundle of fur. At first he thought it was just debris, some forgotten thing left to be swallowed by the cold. But then, 2 trembling golden eyes blinked up at him. A puppy. His breath caught in his chest as he stepped closer, his boots crunching in the thick snow. The little dog was barely moving, its frail body curled tightly against itself in a futile attempt to stay warm. Its once golden fur was soaked, matted with dirt and ice. Snowflakes clung to its small paws, its tiny ribs faintly visible beneath its damp coat. Daniel knelt down, his pulse quickening. The pup's breath was shallow, its body shaking violently. It had long since stopped barking, stopped whining. It had given up calling for help. Something twisted in his chest, an ache he hadn't felt in a long time. He should walk away. Someone else would find it, surely. The world was full of people who cared more than he did. But no one had stopped. Not a single person had noticed. Just like no one had noticed him when Evelyn was gone. His throat tightened as he hesitated, his hands hovering just above the tiny creature. His mind screamed at him to walk away, to not get involved. He wasn't that man anymore. He didn't save things. But Evelyn would have. She had loved animals. She would have bent down without hesitation, wrapped the poor thing in her arms, whispered soft reassurances, and carried it home. She had always believed that every life, no matter how small, was worth saving. Daniel clenched his jaw. Damn it. With a sigh, he shrugged off his thick wool scarf and reached under the car, carefully wrapping the trembling puppy in its warmth. It didn't resist. It barely reacted at all. It was too weak to fight, too close to the edge of oblivion. He lifted the fragile creature into his arms, feeling the unnatural lightness of its body, the weight of neglect, of hunger, of abandonment. He didn't know how long it had been out here, how long it had been waiting for someone to notice. But he had noticed, and for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he wasn't about to let it die alone in the cold. Cradling the small bundle against his chest, Daniel turned toward his truck, his boots sinking deep into the snow as he moved. The storm raged on around him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than the cold. Something that felt almost like purpose. The cold seeped into Daniel Hayes's bones as he tightened his grip around the tiny, trembling bundle in his arms. The pup barely stirred, its fragile body wrapped tightly in his wool scarf. It was so small, so impossibly light. He could feel each breath, shallow, uneven, fading. The storm howled around him, thick snowflakes whipping through the air like tiny shards of ice. The wind bit at his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. His only thought was getting this dog to safety. Daniel yanked open the door of his truck, the hinges groaning in protest against the icy weather. He slid inside, cradling the pup against his chest as he reached for the ignition. His fingers, stiff with cold, twisted the key, and the engine rumbled to life. The heater blasted warm air into the frigid cabin, but it would take time to make a difference. Carefully, he placed the puppy on the passenger seat, making sure it was still wrapped snugly in the scarf. It didn't react. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. The weight in his chest tightened. He had seen this kind of stillness before, the kind that came just before someone slipped away. "Not tonight, kid," he muttered under his breath, shifting the truck into drive. "You hang on." The streets were nearly deserted, the storm having chased most sensible people indoors. The only movement came from the swirling snow and the occasional streetlight flickering against the wind. Daniel clenched the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The veterinary clinic was nearly 15 miles away, 15 miles of treacherous, ice-coated roads. His eyes flicked to the pup. Its breaths were slow, shallow. "Just stay with me," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind outside. The tires crunched over the packed snow as he pulled onto the main road. Visibility was terrible. Beyond his headlights, the world was a swirling blur of white. He leaned forward, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had driven in storms before, had chased suspects through worse conditions, but this felt different. This was a race against time, a battle against the inevitable. As he gained speed, the truck shuddered slightly on the slick pavement. He adjusted his grip, forcing himself to stay steady. Every instinct told him to hurry, but he knew one wrong move could send them both into a ditch, or worse. The road stretched ahead, empty and unforgiving. Snow piled in uneven drifts, the wind pushing against the truck like an invisible force trying to hold him back. The wipers struggled against the accumulating frost, smearing instead of clearing the glass. He flicked on the defroster, willing the windshield to stay clear. A glance at the pup told him time was running out. Its small chest barely moved. Daniel swallowed hard. "Come on, kid. Just a little longer." Then it happened. The truck hit an unseen patch of black ice. For a split second, everything slowed. The tires lost traction, and the world lurched sideways. His heart slammed into his ribs as the back end of the truck fishtailed violently. The headlights swung wildly, illuminating the swirling snow before plunging into darkness again. His instincts screamed at him to react. Years of experience behind the wheel kicked in, and he yanked the wheel in the opposite direction, trying to regain control. But it wasn't enough. The truck spun, the world tilted, and in that fleeting moment, he had to make a choice. The puppy, or the wheel. Daniel's arms moved on their own. His left hand clenched the wheel, his right arm shot out, scooping the fragile pup from the seat and pulling it against his chest. He braced himself as the truck skidded sideways, metal groaning in protest, tires screaming against the ice. Then, impact. The back end of the truck slammed into a snowbank, jolting them both forward. The seatbelt bit into his shoulder, but he barely registered the pain. He exhaled sharply, his breath ragged. Silence. For a long moment he didn't move. Then, slowly, he forced himself to look down. The puppy was still there, still wrapped in his scarf, still pressed against his chest. And it was still breathing. His head fell back against the seat as he let out a shaky breath. "You're tougher than you look, kid." Snow pelted against the windshield, the wind wailing outside. The truck had stalled, but he didn't care. He reached for the ignition with trembling fingers and turned the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared back to life. Daniel didn't waste a second. He threw the truck into gear and pressed on. 15 minutes later, he pulled into the veterinary clinic's small parking lot, the tires skidding slightly as he braked. The lights inside were still on, a miracle at this hour. He barely put the truck in park before shoving the door open and stepping into the storm. The cold slammed into him, but he ignored it. He cradled the pup tightly as he moved toward the entrance, his boots crunching over ice. The door swung open before he reached it. Dr. Harper, a gruff but skilled veterinarian in his early 50s, stood in the doorway, squinting against the wind. His gaze dropped to the bundle in Daniel's arms, and his expression shifted from irritation to concern. "Inside." "Now," Harper ordered, stepping aside. Daniel didn't need to be told twice. The warmth of the clinic was a sharp contrast to the icy night. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the faint scent of antiseptic in the air. Harper led him straight to the examination table, motioning for Daniel to lay the puppy down. As soon as Daniel unwrapped it from the scarf, Harper's frown deepened. "Damn," the vet muttered, pressing his fingers gently against the pup's ribs. "How long has it been like this?" Daniel exhaled. "I found it maybe 30 minutes ago. It was under a car, barely moving." Harper nodded, already moving quickly. He grabbed a stethoscope, pressing it against the pup's tiny chest. His brow furrowed. Daniel swallowed. "How bad?" The vet hesitated. "It's close. Body temperature is dangerously low. If you'd gotten here 10 minutes later..." He shook his head. "It wouldn't have made it." Daniel's stomach tightened. He forced himself to nod, his gaze fixed on the motionless form on the table. "Can you save it?" Harper didn't answer immediately. He reached for an IV bag, carefully inserting a needle into the pup's tiny leg. "We're warming it up slowly," he murmured. "Too fast, and its system could go into shock." He moved with practiced precision, setting up a heated blanket around the small body. Daniel didn't move. He just stood there, hands clenched at his sides, watching. Minutes passed. The room was silent except for the soft beeping of the monitor and the occasional rustle of movement. Then the tiniest sound, a faint, almost imperceptible sigh. Harper glanced up. "It's stabilizing." Daniel exhaled, his body sagging slightly. He hadn't realized just how much tension he had been holding. Harper eyed him. "First time bringing in a stray?" Daniel shook his head. "First time in a long time." The vet studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It's got a chance, but it's going to need care." Daniel looked down at the tiny creature, still curled beneath the blanket. A chance. For the first time in years, Daniel found himself hoping for something. "Then I guess I'd better stick around." Daniel sat in his worn-out armchair, staring at the small bundle curled up on the couch across from him. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows along the walls of his modest cabin. Outside, the wind still howled through the frozen landscape, but inside, there was warmth. Hope, because that was the name he had chosen, lay nestled in a thick fleece blanket, its golden fur now clean, but still too thin, too fragile. Hope. The name had come to him almost as soon as he had seen the tiny dog clinging to life on the vet's table. It wasn't just for the pup's sake. Daniel needed this too. A reason to care about something again. A reason to believe that life had more to offer than just endless winter nights and fading memories. But something about Hope didn't sit right with him. Hope was quiet. Too quiet. Most puppies barked, whined, or at least made some kind of sound, but not Hope. Since the moment Daniel had brought him home, the dog hadn't made a single noise. Not a whimper of hunger, not a yip of excitement, not even a sigh of contentment. If it weren't for the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest, Daniel might have thought he was still fighting for his life. And then, there were the nightmares. The first time Daniel noticed, it was late, past midnight. He had dozed off in his chair, a book open on his lap, the fire reduced to glowing embers. A low, trembling whimper pulled him from sleep. His eyes flickered open, and for a moment, he thought the sound had come from the wind outside. But then, he heard it again. It was coming from Hope. Daniel leaned forward, watching as the little dog twitched in his sleep. His paws moved as if he were running, his ears pinned back against his head. The whimpers grew more urgent, turning into small, desperate cries. It was the sound of fear. Daniel's chest tightened. He reached out instinctively, his hand moving to rest gently on Hope's back. The reaction was instant. Hope jolted awake with a sharp, panicked gasp, his body jerking so violently that he nearly tumbled off the couch. His golden eyes were wide, wild with terror as he scrambled to his feet, pressing himself against the armrest like a trapped animal. His breathing was rapid, shallow, as if he were still caught in whatever nightmare had haunted him. Daniel didn't move. He just sat there, hands still hovering in the air, where Hope had been only seconds before. "Easy, kid," he said softly. "You're safe." Hope didn't seem to hear him. His entire body was tense, his gaze darting around the room as if expecting danger to come from the shadows. It took nearly a full minute before his breathing began to slow, before his rigid posture eased just enough for him to sink back into the blanket, though his ears remained perked, alert. Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. That wasn't normal. Dogs had bad dreams, sure. But this was different. This was the reaction of something or someone who had seen too much, who had been through something no creature ever should. Daniel's mind shifted into old habits, the instincts of a detective kicking in. What had happened to Hope before that night in the snow? He hadn't questioned it before, too focused on keeping the pup alive. But now, sitting there in the dim light, watching Hope carefully settle back down, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Hope had a past, and it wasn't a good one. The next morning, Daniel paid closer attention. As he prepared his usual coffee, he glanced toward the couch where Hope lay curled up. His body was no longer trembling, but he wasn't fully relaxed either. His ears twitched at every noise, the creak of the wooden floor, the pop of the fire, even the distant howl of the wind outside. The dog was on edge. Daniel crouched beside him, careful to move slowly. He extended a hand, letting Hope see it, smell it. The pup's nose twitched, but his body remained still, his golden eyes flicking between Daniel's hand and his face, as if waiting for something bad. "I'm not gonna hurt you, kid," Daniel murmured. Still, Hope didn't move. Daniel's fingers brushed lightly against the dog's fur. That's when he felt it, the ridges along Hope's skin, barely noticeable beneath the fluff of his coat. Scars. His jaw tightened. He pushed Hope's fur aside gently, his trained eyes scanning the marks along the pup's legs. They weren't deep, but they were there. Small, old wounds that had healed just enough to leave faint traces behind. He checked behind one ear and found another, a small notch, barely visible but undeniable. Someone had hurt him. Anger stirred in Daniel's chest, a slow burn that he hadn't felt in a long time. He had seen a lot in his years as a cop, things that could turn a man cold if he wasn't careful, but nothing ever sat right with him when it came to cruelty against those who couldn't fight back. Hope had been through something, and now Daniel wanted to know what. Over the next few days, he started piecing together the little clues Hope unknowingly left behind. Hope hated loud noises. The first time Daniel dropped a metal pan in the kitchen, Hope flinched so hard he nearly fell off the couch. His tail tucked so tightly against his belly that it almost disappeared. He didn't just startle, he cowered. Hope didn't like dark spaces. Daniel found that out when the power flickered one evening, and the sudden dimming of the lights sent Hope bolting to a corner, his small body pressing against the wall as if expecting it to swallow him whole. Hope never begged for food. Most stray dogs, once rescued, were eager, sometimes desperate, for meals. But not Hope. He ate cautiously, carefully, as if expecting the food to be taken away at any moment. Each behavior was a piece of a puzzle Daniel didn't have all the answers to yet. But he was starting to see the picture. Hope hadn't just been abandoned. He had been mistreated. And suddenly, Daniel wasn't just a man who had found a stray dog in the snow. He was a man with a case to solve. His hands curled into fists as he stared at the pup who had unknowingly brought something back into his life, something he thought he had lost along with Evelyn. Purpose. Hope stirred, lifting his head slightly to glance at Daniel. For the first time, Daniel didn't just see a dog. He saw a survivor. And he wasn't about to let anyone hurt him again. The morning air was crisp, carrying the lingering chill of winter despite the slow arrival of spring. Snow still clung to the edges of the sidewalk, melting into slushy patches under the pale sunlight. Daniel adjusted his coat as he stepped outside, the familiar bite of the cold still present but less harsh than before. Hope trotted beside him, his golden fur now thick and clean, though his frame was still lean from months of malnourishment. It had been 3 weeks since that night in the snow. 3 weeks of careful feeding, quiet moments by the fire, and a slow, patient rebuilding of trust. Hope still startled easily, still tensed at sudden movements, but he was getting better. He no longer flinched when Daniel reached for him. He ate without hesitation, tail swishing lazily whenever he finished a meal. This morning was a milestone. It was Hope's first real walk outside. Daniel had waited, knowing instinctively that the world outside might be too much too soon. But Hope needed this. He needed to learn that he was safe now, that not every sound meant danger, that the open air didn't have to be a place of fear. Daniel attached the leash carefully, watching as Hope's ears flicked at the soft click of the buckle. The dog didn't resist, but there was a nervous energy in the way he held himself, his tail low, eyes darting around as if expecting something unseen. "It's just a walk, kid," Daniel murmured, scratching gently behind Hope's ear. "Nothing to worry about." Hope blinked up at him, then took a hesitant step forward. The streets were quiet. Only a few people out at this hour. A woman jogging in a thick hoodie, an older man walking his beagle near the town square. Cars passed occasionally, but the usual noise of the town was subdued beneath the blanket of melting snow. Daniel walked slowly, letting Hope take the lead. The pup sniffed at the air, his steps cautious but steady. With each block they passed, Daniel noticed his posture relaxing, his tail no longer tucked as tightly against his body. For the first time, Hope looked like he belonged in the world. And then, he stopped. Daniel felt it immediately. One moment, Hope was trotting along beside him, his ears perked at the distant chirp of birds. The next, his entire body went rigid. Daniel barely had time to react before Hope shrank back, pressing against his leg, his small frame trembling. Daniel frowned, his instincts flaring. He followed the pup's wide-eyed gaze across the street. A black pickup truck sat idling at the curb. The vehicle itself was unremarkable. Old but well-maintained, its tires slightly dusted with snow, the engine humming low. But it wasn't the truck that set Daniel's nerves on edge. It was the man inside. A figure sat behind the wheel, his face partially obscured by the reflection of the windshield. But even from a distance, Daniel could feel the weight of his stare. Cold. unwavering. Daniel tensed. Hope's reaction was not the response of a dog merely startled by a loud vehicle or unfamiliar noise. This was recognition and terror. The pup's breathing grew rapid, his small body trembling so violently that Daniel instinctively crouched beside him, shielding him with one hand. The man in the truck didn't move, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge them in any way except for the unbroken intensity of his gaze. Then, as if deciding something, he shifted the truck into gear. The tires crunched over the slush-covered road as the vehicle pulled away from the curb. Slowly, deliberately, but not before Daniel caught a glimpse of the driver's face through the side window. A face he didn't recognize, but Hope did. Daniel felt the pup press even closer to him, ears pinned flat, his body shrinking into itself. Whoever that man was, Hope knew him, and that meant Daniel needed to know him too. He stayed crouched beside Hope long after the truck disappeared down the street, his pulse steady but alert. Years on the force had sharpened his instincts, trained him to recognize when something wasn't right. This wasn't right. Hope wasn't just any abandoned stray. Someone had owned him before. Someone who had left scars beneath his fur, both seen and unseen, and that someone might still be looking for him. Daniel exhaled, running a hand along Hope's back, feeling the rapid thrum of his heartbeat beneath his palm. "It's okay, kid," he murmured. "He's gone." Hope didn't move. Daniel's gaze hardened. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, the dim light from the overhead lamp casting long shadows across the room. The weight of the morning's encounter still clung to him, heavy and unresolved. Hope lay curled at his feet, unusually still, his golden fur rising and falling with slow, deep breaths. He had calmed down since the black truck disappeared, but Daniel hadn't missed the way his body had stiffened, the silent terror that had gripped him. Hope knew that man, and that meant Daniel needed to find out who he was. The instinct to investigate, to chase down the truth, had lain dormant in him for years. He thought he had buried it when he left the force, choosing a life of solitude over the endless weight of unsolved cases and sleepless nights. But now it clawed its way back to the surface, sharp and relentless. He reached for his phone. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Carter." "Hey, it's Daniel." A pause, then a chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned. Thought you finally retired from the world." Daniel smirked. "Almost did." Another pause, this one more curious. "This isn't just a social call, is it?" Daniel exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. "I need a favor." The drive to the precinct was familiar in a way that unsettled him. The streets hadn't changed much since he'd last been here, but Daniel had. The station was quieter than he remembered, though the same hum of activity lingered beneath the surface. Officers moving between desks, phones ringing, paperwork being shuffled, some faces he recognized, others were new. Carter was waiting for him in his office, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a raised brow. "Whatever this is about, you've got my attention." Daniel closed the door behind him, getting straight to the point. "I need to look into someone." Carter leaned back in his chair. "You realize you don't have a badge anymore, right?" Daniel smirked. "Just need you to run a name." Carter studied him for a moment, then sighed. "All right. Who are we looking for?" Daniel hesitated, then said, "I don't have a name, but I do have a dog." Carter blinked. "Come again?" Daniel leaned forward. "I found a puppy a few weeks ago, barely alive, abandoned in a snowstorm. But this wasn't just some stray. He's been hurt before, Carter. And today, he saw someone. Someone who made him freeze like he'd seen a ghost." Carter's expression turned serious. "What kind of hurt are we talking about?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Scars, fear, and a reaction to a black pickup that tells me this isn't a coincidence." Carter exhaled and turned to his computer. All right, let's see if there's anything worth digging up. Minutes passed, the soft clatter of keys filling the silence. Then Carter's expression shifted. He clicked on a file, frowning as he scanned the screen. Gordon Flint. He looked up. Ring any bells? Daniel shook his head. Should it? Carter's mouth pressed into a thin line. He's bad news. Was suspected in multiple cases of animal cruelty, but we never had enough to pin anything solid on him. Witnesses wouldn't talk. No concrete evidence. Daniel's gut twisted. How bad? Carter hesitated, then turned the screen toward him. Bad. Daniel's eyes skimmed the reports. Cases of dogs found abandoned, some barely alive, others not so lucky. The details were clinical, detached, but the weight of them settled deep. Why wasn't he put away? Carter sighed. Like I said, no proof. We knew he was behind it, but he was careful, slippery bastard. He leaned back. But you might be in luck. We picked him up last week on unrelated charges. He's in holding now. Daniel's mind worked quickly. I want to see him. Carter gave him a long look. You sure about that? Daniel glanced down at Hope, who was sitting quietly by his side, ears twitching slightly as if sensing the shift in tension. Yeah, he said. I'm sure. The holding cells were colder than he remembered. Carter led the way, his boots echoing against the tile floor. The smell of stale coffee and disinfectant lingered in the air. Gordon Flint was sitting behind the bars of a small cell, his hands resting lazily on his knees. He was in his late 40s with greasy dark hair and a smirk that suggested he thought none of this was permanent. When he saw Daniel, his gaze barely flickered, but then his eyes landed on Hope, and he grinned. Well, well, he drawled. Look who's still breathing. Daniel felt Hope stiffen beside him, but this time the dog didn't cower. Flint chuckled. I'll admit, I figured the storm would take care of you. Guess you're tougher than you look. Daniel's fingers curled around Hope's leash. You know this dog? Flint's smirk widened. Oh, I know plenty of dogs. Some last longer than others. The restrained fury in Daniel's chest burned hot, but he didn't let it show. Flint leaned forward slightly. You got a real soft spot, don't you, Hayes? Always trying to save the ones no one else gives a damn about. He tilted his head. But let me tell you something. You can wrap that mud in all the blankets you want, but that fear, that never really goes away. Something shifted beside him. Hope had been silent through the entire exchange, but now, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, the small golden dog straightened. His ears perked, his body no longer shrinking into itself. And then, for the first time since Daniel had found him, Hope let out a single, sharp bark. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it was strong. Flint's grin faltered. Daniel crouched beside Hope, his voice low, steady. You hear that? He murmured. That's what winning sounds like. Hope's tail wagged slightly, just once. And for the first time, Daniel saw it. Genuine defiance. The embers of something that had almost been extinguished but never fully lost. Carter cleared his throat. All right, we're done here. Daniel stood, giving Flint one last look before turning. Enjoy your stay. As they walked away, Hope trotted beside him, his steps lighter than before. Daniel glanced down, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. You did good, kid. Hope didn't reply, but he didn't need to. The air inside Daniel's cabin was warm, carrying the familiar scent of burning wood from the fireplace. The glow of the flames flickered along the walls, casting a soft golden hue over the small living room where Hope lay stretched out on the rug. His golden fur had filled out over the past few weeks, no longer thin and brittle from starvation. His ribs were no longer visible beneath his coat, and for the first time since Daniel had found him, Hope looked like a dog who belonged somewhere. But what mattered most wasn't how Hope looked. It was how he acted. Hope no longer flinched at the sound of the front door opening. He no longer shrank at sudden movements. He didn't wake up in the middle of the night, trembling from nightmares of a past he couldn't escape. Instead, he slept soundly, nestled in the warmth of the blanket Daniel had given him. He had survived, and more than that, he had healed. The sound of tires crunching over gravel pulled Daniel's attention to the window. He stood, glancing out just in time to see a small car pull up the driveway. A familiar face peered out from the back seat, bright-eyed, full of curiosity. Lucy. Daniel's 10-year-old niece had been asking to meet Hope since the day she'd heard about him. She had called almost every night, begging her mom to let her come over. "Please, Uncle Danny, just once. I want to meet him." Daniel had hesitated at first, not because he didn't want her to meet Hope, but because he wasn't sure how Hope would react. The dog had come a long way, but he still had moments of hesitation, moments where Daniel could see ghosts of his past clinging to him. Would he trust a child? Would he let someone so small, so eager, into the safe little world he had begun to build? Daniel wasn't sure. But today, he was ready to find out. A knock at the door was followed by the excited shuffle of boots against the porch. Daniel pulled the door open, letting in a gust of cold air. Lucy stood there, bundled in a thick coat and scarf, her cheeks pink from the winter air. She grinned up at him, bouncing on her toes. "Where is he?" she asked, peering past Daniel into the cabin. Daniel smirked. "Why don't you come in and find out?" She needed no further invitation. Stepping inside, she pulled off her hat, her blonde curls bouncing around her shoulders as she looked around eagerly. And then her eyes landed on Hope. The dog had lifted his head at the sound of her voice, his ears twitching as he observed the newcomer. He didn't move, not yet. His golden eyes watched her, calm but cautious. Lucy didn't rush toward him. She was smart. She had grown up around dogs, knew better than to overwhelm them, especially ones who had been hurt before. So instead she did something Daniel hadn't expected. She sat down, right there on the wooden floor, a few feet away from Hope. She crossed her legs, rested her hands on her knees, and smiled. "Hi there," she said softly. "My name's Lucy." Hope's ears flicked. "You're even prettier than Uncle Danny said," she continued, her voice warm and easy. "I really wanted to meet you, but you don't have to come over if you don't want to. I'll wait." Daniel leaned against the wall, crossing his arms as he watched. Hope hesitated. For a long moment, he just lay there, eyes flicking between Lucy and Daniel as if trying to decide what to do. Then, slowly, tentatively, he moved. It was just a small shift at first, a slight rise in his posture, a subtle uncurling of his front paws. His body language was careful, but there was no fear in his movements. And then, to Daniel's surprise, Hope stood. With deliberate steps, he crossed the space between them. Lucy didn't move, didn't reach out. She simply let him come to her. When he finally reached her, he paused, giving her a soft sniff. Then, as if making up his mind, he did something that made Daniel's chest tighten. He placed his head gently on her lap. Lucy let out a breathless laugh, her hands hovering for a second before finally resting lightly against Hope's fur. She stroked him carefully, fingers threading through the golden strands. "You're a good boy," she whispered. "A very good boy." Daniel exhaled slowly. Hope had chosen her. And in that moment, he knew. Hope needed more than just safety. He needed love. He needed someone who could be there for him every single day, someone with boundless patience, someone who would run through the yard with him, curl up beside him at night, and remind him that the world wasn't a place to be afraid of. Lucy was that person. That night, after Lucy had left, only because her mother had practically dragged her out the door, Daniel sat by the fire. Hope curled beside him. He ran a hand through the dog's fur, feeling the steady warmth beneath his fingers. "You like her, don't you?" he murmured. Hope shifted slightly, sighing against Daniel's leg. Daniel stared into the fire, his jaw tightening slightly. He had never been good at letting things go. But this wasn't loss. This was giving Hope something better, a real home. The next day, he made the call. When Lucy answered, her excitement was almost enough to make him laugh. "Really? You mean it? He can stay with me?" Daniel smiled. "Yeah, kid. He's yours." Lucy's joy was contagious, but as Daniel hung up, he felt something unexpected settle in his chest. It wasn't sadness, it was peace. Hope wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. The first snowfall of winter came early that year. Daniel stood in Lucy's backyard, hands in his coat pockets, watching as Hope raced through the snow, kicking up white flurries as he chased after Lucy. She was laughing, bundled in layers, her cheeks pink from the cold. Hope barked, an actual bark, full of excitement as he bounded toward her, his tail wagging furiously. Daniel shook his head, smiling. Lucy turned toward him, her eyes bright. "Aren't you going to come play, Uncle Danny?" Daniel smirked. "I think I'll leave that to you two." Hope ran back to him, pressing his head against Daniel's side for a brief moment, before turning and bolting after Lucy again. Daniel watched them, something warm settling deep in his chest. Last winter, Hope had been alone. This winter, he had a family. And so did Daniel. There's something deeply human about the way we connect with animals, especially dogs. Perhaps it's their unwavering loyalty, their ability to love despite hardship, or the silent understanding they offer without judgment. This is one of those heartwarming stories, a reminder that even in the coldest, loneliest moments, kindness can change everything. Among the many dog stories that tug at our hearts, the ones that stay with us are often those about resilience, about an abandoned dog left to fend for itself, unsure if the world still has room for it. These stories reflect something far greater than a simple act of rescue. They remind us of our own need for connection, for second chances, and for the quiet but profound impact of compassion. It's easy to walk past what we don't want to see. A shivering dog on the street. A life left behind. The suffering of something small and silent. But every once in a while, someone stops. Someone looks closer. And in that moment, the course of a life is altered forever. Not just for the one being saved, but for the one who chooses to save. The bond between a human and a dog isn't built on grand gestures. It's built in the quiet, simple moments. The cautious wag of a tail after days of fear, the warmth of a trusting head resting against a lap, the realization that safety isn't just a place, but a feeling. When a dog that has known only abandonment learns to love again, it's not just survival, it's healing. But the most powerful part of heartwarming stories like this one isn't just the transformation of the dog. It's the way it changes the person, too. To take in something broken and help it mend is to confront our own vulnerabilities, to realize that trust isn't just something we give, it's something we earn. And in that exchange, something remarkable happens. Loneliness fades, purpose returns, and both lives find new meaning. Not all acts of kindness make the news. Not all heroes wear capes. Sometimes they wear old coats, with tired hands and guarded hearts. And yet they still choose to reach out, to kneel down in the snow, to offer warmth where there is none. And in doing so, they remind us all of something we often forget. No one deserves to be left behind. No life is too small, too lost, or too broken to be saved. Because love, at its core, is about showing up, even when no one else does. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.